is the opposition team ready? Okay. With that, good afternoon, everybody, and I just want to extend a thank you to everybody for being here. Today's motion is that the United States federal government should significantly reform its relationship with Egypt. Judge, today I'm talking to you. I want to convince you of why at the end of my speech, and when I give you my rebuttal as the last speech of this debate, why the proposition team should win. My partner and I believe that we have a strong case, a strong plan, and we're excited to present it to you. So with that, in my speech today, I'm pretty much going to focus on two main things. Laying out the criteria of today's ground, and then also presenting contentions of why you should support our plan. So with that, let's look at the definitions. As I stated, the motion is that the United States federal government should significantly reform its relationship with Egypt. Now, I'm going to really give straightforward definitions, but the United States federal government is, of course, the United States federal government, the government that we all belong to, that creates the laws of our nation and conducts foreign policy. Significantly reform is to change the policy of, so we're changing the policy of the relationship that we have with Egypt, and Egypt, of course, as the government currently trying to establish itself as a democracy in today's world. Now, we define this as a policy motion with the judging criteria of net benefits to the United States and Egypt. And with that idea of this being a policy motion, what that means is that according to Chassis State rules, the proposition team presents a plan, or a solution. Now, this is just an idea of how we want to fix a problem. We first present a problem, and then present this plan and say, you know, yeah, there's a problem, and this is how we need to alleviate it. What the opposition team needs to do is they either need to say, you know what, no, there's not a problem, this is great, the status quo is great, or they say, you know, we agree that there's a problem, but we have a better way to solve this. So while they can choose what they have a couple of options, what we're doing in today's speech is presenting you a problem. And that problem, Judge, is what's currently going on in Egypt. What we saw in Egypt after the fall of President Hosni Mubarak was that nobody really knew what to do. Power was sort of left to the military, and democracy is trying to be revitalized there, but there's direction still missing. So, of course, the United States continues with its aid that it's been providing to Egypt under President Mubarak, but what we're doing now what we need to be doing instead is make that aid, but what we've seen is that money, and what we see is that the military is in control, which is okay, but this is the problem, Judge. The problem is that the military has too much control over the nation. Even before the revolution, what we saw was that the military controlled not only just the armed forces, but also much of the economy. We point to Joshua Satcher of Kent State University in Ohio, who states that the military actually controls 1/3 of the Egyptian economy. What this means is that the military is reaching not outside of the bounds of protecting its people, more into the bounds of providing for its people. And that's a clear difference. In fact, we looked at the El Nasser company, just one corporation that the Egyptian military owns, and we see that this company employs almost 8,000 employees. And you think El Nasser company run by the Egyptian military, you think maybe they're building bombs, they're building weapons, artillery, whatever. Unfortunately, Judge, they're taking care of children, they're providing hotel administration services, and they're providing mobile repair. They're fixing cars. This is great. This needs to happen in Egypt, but the military, Judge, shouldn't be doing this. And I'm going to present that through my contentions in our case. But first, before that, let's look at the plan. As the proposition team, we believe that starting effective now, that the U.S. should make all aid conditional on the U.S. military's withdrawal from these sectors. While we know that the military will ultimately be, during this transition, will be in charge of the government as a whole, it needs to transition these jobs in these sectors outside of the military in order to get aid. This aid, as long as Egypt will make this plan and effectively carries it out, the U.S. will still be aiding Egypt, but instead, it'll make sure that this aid doesn't get into the hands of the military. And before I get into the contentions and really flesh out the reasons why this is great and why this is needed, I would like to take their first of 2 points of information.
Sorry, would you just mind repeating the plan?
Sure. Our plan is to make sure that is to make all U.S. aid conditional on the U.S. on the Egyptian military getting outside of the sectors that don't deal with national security or protecting from foreign invaders. We believe, and this is a perfect segue to my first point, we believe that the military is the military, Judge. That's my first point. The military has priorities that it should have, and unfortunately in Egypt, it's reached beyond that. It's created priorities that just really don't make sense. We looked at this where we see a military is taking care of children. The military is taking care of fixing people's cars and doing all of this. And this shouldn't be what it's doing. They should instead default these services to other entities, like the Department of the Ministry of the Interior or other social services. We look to what we see in the United States. We have the Department of Health and Human Services. We have the Department of Education. We have the Department of Agriculture. We have all these different interior ministries, these interior departments. This is what Egypt should be doing. Let's look to Nigeria, where we actually saw that in Nigeria, militaries were able to take over. We don't want this to happen in Egypt. We want the transition between military and civilian power to be quick and easy. With the military in control of 1/3 of the economy, it'll make it even more and more difficult for this transition to happen. So the impact of this is, it's undemocratic, but if we want it to become democratic eventually, this needs to happen. Let's look at our second point. Better for the U.S. This is the judging criterion itself. It's better for the United States to have the military weakened in this regard. We want it to be safe and to provide for the security, but we don't want it overreaching its boundaries. The impact of this is better solvency for the United States as a whole, and to our ultimate foreign policy goals. Now, the third contention is better for the people. Judge, ask yourself, what's better for the people? What's better? If the military is controlling their lives, or if they're controlling their lives? By restoring power back to the people, back to democratically elected representatives, and not generals, what we'll see is a better, healthier, thriving Egypt. And with that, I thank you and I ask for the vote.
All right. So the motion that we're debating today is the United States federal government should significantly reform its relationship with Egypt. Now, the affirmative team has stated that the judging criteria should be net benefits to the U.S. and Egypt, and we think this is entirely appropriate. Now, they stated that the problem that's going on in Egypt right now is that the power is left to the military, and they stress this throughout their entire case. Now, first off, I'd just like to mention that they don't really have an actual harm to this, but that'll probably become clear as the speech goes on. Now, they stated that the military is in control and how this is such a bad thing. And as the negation team, we'd just like to bring up the fact that the military is in control right now because power has changed. A corrupt dictatorship has stepped down or been taken out of power, and in order for an actual democracy to happen, they have to have actual elections. And they say, oh, we want these elections to be speedy and quick, and we want the military out of power. But what the affirmative team has failed to address today is that if we were to have elections tomorrow for Egypt, for a democratically elected president, there would not be any time for campaigning. There would not be any time for people to figure out who they're going to vote for or why they should vote for somebody, and it would end up doing more harm than good to the nation because somebody who would be incorrect for the place of power would be put in power. Please keep this in mind as I take their first POI.
Are you aware that we're not suggesting an election? We're not even suggesting that the military move outside of its range as the chief
But
executive.
you're stating that the military should be removed from power, and that brings me back to your speech. You stated that the military has control of the economy and how they're doing all these things for the people and how it's just they're overstepping their boundaries. The military shouldn't be in control of this. However, the military is the current government in Egypt. Because they haven't had time to have an actual democratic election, the military is their government. Now, since this is their current government, what they're doing for the people right now is just as appropriate as what the United States does in forms of Medicare, Social Security, welfare, etc. So, the current government of Egypt is doing things for the people. They are supposedly overstepping their boundaries, but when they are the actual government to this entire nation, this is entirely appropriate. This is what they should be doing. Now, okay, so, and another point that we have to address this contention is that the United States should not be deciding how a country runs itself, especially in Egypt right now, because they're in the process of changing power. When they're in the process of changing power, yes, they will have elections in time when it's appropriate for them to do so. However, the time is not right now because they need to first stabilize their country, which the government is trying to do, providing aid to the people by setting up schools and health clinics and supposedly overstepping their boundaries. Without this, the people would be in worse shape than they are now. And if we were to if we were to pressure them to remove their government from power, which is their military, not only would they be weaker as individuals, would the individuals have less be at a disadvantage in their own country, but the government itself would not be able to change because they wouldn't even have time for their elections. Now, they stated that this is better for the U.S. However, this is not better for the U.S. whatsoever. If the U.S. tries to step in and say, oh, we're not going to give you this aid that you need desperately when you're changing power because you have a government that is made up of your military, even though it's necessary, this would only be reducing the United States' soft power because we would be looking like a police force, just like I think we're all aware that the world sometimes looks down on the U.S. a little bit because they think we get our hands a bit too dirty in other people's issues. Now, if the U.S. is getting too dirty in other people's issues, then it's reducing our soft power because we're once again having people think that we look like a police force. Please keep this in mind as I take this second.
Are we getting too involved in other people's issues? If anything, by enacting this plan, we're saying we're taking our hands off.
That's not what you're proposing. You're proposing that we make our aid to this country, the country that desperately needs it, conditional and under the condition that they take their government from power. Their government is the military, yes, but it's necessary, and I think that we've already outlined this. If they were to take their government from power because they needed the money from the U.S., they wouldn't have any way to allocate these resources because they wouldn't have a government. They wouldn't have a government, or they press the elections on, but they wouldn't be able to elect an appropriate leader for their country. Now, they stated that this is better for the people. This is their third contention. However, what would be best for the people is a government that represents the people. And yeah, the affirmative team would like a speedy election, but this election is once again not appropriate until the people have a chance to actually have their campaigns to decide who's going to be best to be our leader. If we were in a time if our government was completely eliminated from power right now, and then there was immediately another election, you wouldn't know who were on the ballots. You wouldn't have time to see what they're going to do for your country, how they're going to affect your life, and how they're going to affect the lives of everyone around you, your allies, your neighbors. If the people don't know this, then there is no way to have an actual, speedy, efficient election. Please keep this in mind as I take the final POI.
You just mentioned so much about an election, about the changing of power, but when did we ever mention election?
Well, you stated that we need to make our aid conditional under the condition that they remove their military from power. If their military is removed from power and they don't have an election, if they don't have anything else, then a group is going to take power of their country, and we can't allow that to happen. That would not be best representing the needs of the U.S. to spread democracy. That would not be best representing the wants of the people. And it would definitely not be helping our relationship with anybody. Yes?
Sorry, just a point of clarification. Our plan was not to remove the military. Our plan was to actually make lateral substitution, saying the military shouldn't be doing jobs like childcare and auto fixing. Those jobs should be given to the people, but we're still going to maintain the military.
The people cannot do this. The military is their government. In the United States, our government has many social services, like Social Security, like welfare, like Medicare, like Medicaid. Now, these are all necessary for the people in order for people to be above the poverty line, for people to have health care, for people to have money for food to eat, to have something to put on the plate for their children. And if we remove these powers from Egypt's government, not just their military, but their government, then the people will be thrown into chaos. Their country is already hurting enough right now, and if the people were put in a position where they couldn't put food on their plates for their children, then this wouldn't be helping anyone. Now, I hope you keep this in mind as you cast a ballot today, because the affirmative team has not only not shown why what the military is doing is wrong, but they're saying that you should be limiting if you affirm the government team's plan right here, you're affirming that the U.S. should not have any social services whatsoever either, because it's the exact same scenario. Thank you.
All right, is everyone ready? Just as a quick roadmap before we start time, I'm going to go through our case and then try to...
we're not doing Kubo, Jason. You can start time.
Yeah, you can't. I'm sorry.
Okay, as I start the time, I'd like to decrease tensions here. Everyone's a little bit freaked out. But as a quick roadmap, while time is going, I'm going to go through our case, and then I'm going to try to go through their case, which they didn't really have, but I'm going to try to pick off some points that they may have mentioned that didn't have exact, explicit taglines. So basically, we provided a lot of framework for today's debate, giving you a plan and everything. And what they did is they attacked our benefits. So they basically didn't attack our plan at all, saying if we did our plan, they basically agreed that our plan would be able to happen. They didn't attack any time frame, any age of action, any whatsoever, which we agreed that was a very strong plan. So they basically agreed that if we were to take on the plan, it would happen. If we were to take on a plan, it would come into play. And they never refuted this plan. So basically, our plan stands as it could happen. Now all they refuted was the benefits of the plan. Basically saying that these benefits aren't true, or they tried to turn some of these, and I'm going to go through these. So our first contention is that the military is the military, and we're saying that the military is overdoing its job, is overextending itself, and what they basically refuted to that saying is they said the military is adequate. And if I quote them, they say that the military is the government. But judges, step back from this, step back from your flows for a second. I quoted them saying 2 or 3 times saying the military is the government. But that's what we're arguing. We're saying that's the problem. The problem is the military is the government. We don't want the military to be in the government. Look to countries where the military is the government. Robert Mugabe, Nigeria, where these countries where the military is the government, it overextends itself, it becomes a dictatorship. It becomes the leader of the military is just commanding the military to do whatever it wants, and then it does it. What we're trying to do is transition Egypt. It just had its revolution. Instead of going into the military path, we wanted to go into the democracy path. In order to do that, we need to make conditional aid, saying that we want you to decrease power from the military. What a slippery slope argument was brought up by the opposition is they kind of, just to clarify this, they thought that our plan was to completely get rid of the military, but that's completely ludicrous. We would never do that. Our plan, if you look back, was that the United States now would make all aid conditional with military, and with military withdrawal from certain sectors that don't deal with national security. So what we didn't say withdraw all military. We said, look, military, you don't need to be doing these odd jobs such as childcare services or mobile repair or hotel administration. These jobs, these auto repair, hotel administration, don't need to be done by people with guns. They need to be done with people, with the civilians, with the people who have jobs. So right now, what they responded to our first argument, the military is the military, they said that the military is the government. And we're saying, yes, that's what the problem is. They never gave us a benefit to the military being the government. What we're saying is, yes, you clearly give us what the status quo is, that the military is the government. But what we're arguing, Judge, is we want to transition from that. We don't want a Nigeria. We don't want a country where the military is the focus point of policy decision making. What we're doing is we're transferring some of the power of the military, transferring some of the aid, some of the money given to the military to making jobs for the public, for the people. Our second contention was on U.S. benefits, that the U.S. actually benefits from this, and they basically argued soft power, saying that we would decrease our soft power because we look like a police force. But let's look at this, judges. This is a ridiculous refutation, because if they argue our soft power is going to decrease because we're going to look more like a police power, then if we were trying to decrease, if our soft power is decreasing because of this, well, then we should have backed out of NATO, the UN, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. The current status quo is the United States is the police force. We are in Afghanistan. We're in Iraq. We're a part of the United Nations. We're huge in that. We lead NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. By aiding Egypt into a democratic revolution, we're not going to be decreasing our soft power at all. In fact, we turn this argument saying that we're going to be increasing our soft power, saying, look, we don't just go into Iraq because we're afraid of our country. We go into Egypt. We go into Tunisia. We go into Libya, or or we aid Libya, or we aid these efforts for democracy. We're doing this, and this increases our soft power. What country has engaged in negotiations with the United States saying, oh my gosh, you help other countries, oh my gosh, you give aid to other countries, you are bad for that, you give money to other countries to promote good ideals, you're bad for that? They never prove to you that, one, we decrease our soft power, or two, that promoting this police force has ever been a detriment ever. What we're doing is we're not even harming U.S. civilians, all we're doing is giving them aid to promote democratic revolutions. A democratic country, this is something that's good for our soft power. That argument was clearly turned. The refutation was turned. So that's like a fourth argument, is soft power. Our third argument is that there's a better lifestyle to the people of Egypt. And they say, well, we need to do what's best for the government. And again, they said that we need a government that represents them. I literally quote them, a government that represents them. But then I argue, your first refutation was the military as the government. But I ask you, Judge, is the military the representation of the people? What we're arguing is saying the military is the government. We don't like that. We want to make it more a democratic government. They're saying we want a government that represents the people. What represents the people more, a democratic government or a military? You clearly vote for the democratic government because the ideals of a democracy are by the people, for people. That's a better representation of the people. If we look to the benefits for the people of Egypt and their only refutation was we want something that represents the people better, we've turned this refutation also because something that represents the people better is a democratic country. We have to recognize we're not getting rid of the military. We're saying, military, you have way too much power. We want to transition some of the power the military has to the interior. We want to put the civilians at the top, military one branch, and interior in the other branch. Right now, the military has way too much of the interior power. We need to be transitioning. We're making a lateral substitution, judges, and we need to recognize this. A lot of what the opposition team was arguing, saying we got rid of the military, that's bad. But one, it's fallacious to say that we're getting rid of the military because we never are. And two, they never proved to us that promoting the military is better than not promoting the military. So now let's go to their case. I really didn't get their case, but they never really gave you any arguments or taglines. The only argument I got is that the U.S. should not decide, is basically what they said. The time is not now. But I argue, why is the time not now? Currently, Egypt is very fragile. It's the new country, the new government of Egypt is days old. Right now, it's a fledgling democracy. What we need is a superpower democracy, i.e. the United States, helping this fledgling democracy. We need conditional aid. We need to say, look, you can't be supporting the military. You need to be supporting your democratic government. You need to be going with elections. And basically, one of their best arguments, or one of their biggest arguments, was that, elections now, that would be a problem. But we need to look at this. Elections right now is status quo. Elections planning are status quo. So we couldn't include in our plan, okay, we're going to plan elections, because the United States is already planning elections. That's status quo. If we look to it, they presented no counter plan. And they presented nothing of a change. So basically, they like the status quo, what is right now. Basically, what this debate has come down to is, would you rather have the democratic government ruling the people, ruling Egypt, or a military ruling Egypt? What we see is that we have better relations with a democratic government. It's better for the people, it's better for the United States, and the military will better fulfill its role as a military, not as a government. You, judge, vote for a democratic government, not for a military government. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? Thank you everyone so much for being here today. Now I'm going to start off my speech with a few housekeeping issues. I'm going to go into their harms and the way they set the framework for today's debate and attack it and really show why it's inadequate for today's round. Basically, they said that the weighing mechanism would be net benefits to Egyptians and to Americans. And today I'm really going to show you why their plan does not solve for either. Really, Judge, you must ask yourself at the end of this round, does the proposition's plan better the lives of Americans? And does the proposition's plan better the lives of Egyptians? And I'm going to show you further in my speech why not only does it not do this, but it's superfluous and it harms our image in the Middle East. So let's go on to their two harms that they addressed. Their first harm was that the military is in control, and their second harm was of the economy. Now, the first harm that they addressed of the military is in control, well, this is an assertion, this is an observation, but they show no reason why this is actually hurting the people of Egypt, why this is actually bringing harm to the people of Egypt. They try and make this connection later on in their case,
in their first contention that the military is the military, and so therefore we can't have the military providing daycare. Judges, they really show no link why this is possibly harmful. They show no reasoning why this would lead to an end to all children and how this would hurt daycare in any way. They're not showing you why the military providing these services is harming Egyptians, and that's why their contention and their entire case is completely irrelevant. But to further address this, they were mistaken when they addressed our point of elections, and they tried to clarify it by saying, well, we're not arguing just for elections, we're arguing for a transfer of power. Judges, what is more undemocratic than just appointing random people to then pursue programs? No. Currently, the status quo, which is what the negation is arguing, is that in fall 2011, the already scheduled elections will take place. And as the status quo, we will wait to see how democracy unfolds before taking action. However, they argue that this is a transfer of power. Judges, they want to randomly appoint people to provide these services for their people. This is completely detrimental to Egyptians, and it absolutely has no logic involved. This is completely undemocratic, so their entire framework of democracy is completely unweighable. Their second harm that they address of the economy, well, basically, we need to address this idea. They say that the military controls 1/3 of the economy. For example, China controls 100% of its economy. Who are we to tell a country how their economy should be run and what percentage their government gets to control it? So regardless of the military or who's controlling it, their argument is that the government controls 1/3. Well, let's look at how much of our government, or how much of our economy is red taped and how it's protected by the bureaucracy. Let's look over at China, where 100% of the market is controlled by the government. This is completely irrelevant. Their logic is completely absent. So let's talk about their first point. They talk about the military is the military. However, we want to point out that they do not address why this is actually hurting Egyptians. They want you to believe that the military is hurting these programs and they're not providing the full potential, but they show no link, they show no logic, they show no information, and they have no credibility because they have no statistics to prove that this is actually happening. But I really want to talk to you about what the main heart of the debate is really about. They say that they don't prove that we decrease soft power, but there is a difference between aiding a nation with money for food for their people and using money for a bargaining tool to Americanize a country. The proposition team wants to Americanize Egypt. And sure, that is fine if that is really what they think America wants, but let's talk about this. They want to use the aid that is currently being given to the Egyptians below the poverty line, helping them receive food so that they are not dying of starvation. They want to take this money. That is what the aid is going to, by the way. They want to take this money and funnel it towards a bargaining mechanism in order to Americanize it. But furthermore, we must point out that if Americanizing is democracy, we must wait for democracy, because the proposition would like you to say that would like you to believe that democracy is actually going to come with appointed random officials. No, Judge. Corruption will come with appointing random officials. The only way democracy will come is by these true democratic elections that are planned and being held this November. I'm sorry, I have a lot to get through. I will take your point if I have time. So let's talk about their second contention. Sure. Their second contention is that how it is better for the United States. They spent about 30 seconds on this point. They really didn't follow it through. And I just want to ask you one question. How, in one possible way, is this actually better for American citizens? Bargaining the money that if we are spending, we would rather have it spent in a potentially beneficial way. When our economy is failing, when our education systems are failing, if we're going to use this money in any way, it better be productive if it's not on Americans. So furthermore, they say that we want to bring it to the democracy path. We want to get on the democracy path. by replacing program directors with random non-elected people is the most undemocratic thing possible. So let's talk, I'm sorry, I'm in protected time. Let's talk a little bit about the status quo, because that's what we're advocating for the negation team. They say, well, we didn't really have a plan. I'm sorry if we didn't lay it out, but it is in fact the status quo. So let's talk about why the status quo is actually beneficial. Our plan is waiting for the fall 2011 Democratic election. The reason why this is way better than the entirety of the proposition's plan is that their entire plan is the most undemocratic principle possible. They think that transferring of power is democratic and will lead to positive change. No, judges, it will lead to detrimental change. It will lead to a halt in any progress Egypt has seen in the past few months. Furthermore, their policy has absolutely no solvency. They do not show in any way how, even if this bargaining mechanism would be taken into place, how it would be effective. Furthermore, the most we can see is that it would anger the military, who is the government currently, and it would end treaties currently with Israel, disrupting the peace currently with Israel and Middle Eastern relations. The entire plan is detrimental. Thank you, and I urge a vote for the negation. I'm sorry I didn't get your questions. That was rude. I know. I'm sorry.
Okay, is everyone ready? Alright, so the motion that we've debated today is that the United States federal government should significantly reform its relationship with Egypt. Now I'm just going to go through and present a few voting issues today. Our first voting issue is that the affirmative team would have you believe that reducing the power of the military would benefit Egypt. They don't say who would provide the services that the military would no longer be able to. This means that the people would be thrown into poverty and that the people would no longer be able to benefit from services that United States citizens benefit from as well. If the government is taking away these horrible, horrible powers that they have to provide health care and to provide things like welfare and daycare for the people, then who is going to do it? Egypt is in a state of chaos right now, and if their own government is not able to provide these services, no one is going to be able to, and the affirmative team has not shown who would do this. Our second voting issue today is that the affirmative team ignores the fact that the government simply has power until Egypt can actually hold a democratic election. The affirmative team has countless times stated that they want a democratic Egypt and that this is the goal and how a vote for the affirmative is a vote for democracy. However, this is completely not true. If an election is held tomorrow in Egypt, the elected officials will not represent the people. There has not been time for actual campaigning, for the process that goes on before an election. They haven't stated how this is going to help the people achieve democracy, but they've simply stated that, oh, well, the government should, or the military should be in power. If the military isn't in power, or the military shouldn't have these powers such as daycare and social services, then and they haven't stated who is going to have that power, and they haven't addressed the fact that the status quo is already moving towards democracy. Please take this in mind as I take the POI.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you just clarify this misconception really quickly? You say that when we don't know who's going to be taking place in the government, who's going to be fulfilling if we're not having elections, but do you realize elections are status quo, as you mentioned so far in fall of 2011? So all of your harm saying we don't know who's going to be in charge of the government are status quo.
No, it's not. You're arguing for the status quo. You're saying you're arguing a plan. See, it's your burden as the affirmative team to argue a plan that's not the status quo. Now, if you're arguing that we need a democratic Egypt and that we need to remove powers from the military, then somebody else has to take on these powers, or else the people will be put into poverty. If nobody else is taking these powers until this election, then that's a problem. So if the military is allowed to maintain these powers to help the people until this election that is the status quo, which is what the negation is arguing, then this is most beneficial to the people. So any argument for democracy is an argument for the negation. Please keep this in mind as I take their second POI.
But wouldn't you agree that I made it very clear in my first speech, and my partner brought it up too, that when the military stops having these services, the Interior Department will take over, the Domestic Department. We brought these up. I mentioned the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Education. I mentioned these things as ministries and departments that the Egyptian government would create, or that would take over these services.
But these shouldn't be taking over any powers until there actually is an elected officials in power to decide what happens in their own country. It shouldn't be up to the U.S. to say, this is what we think should be happening, this is what we think you should have control of, this is what we think you should have control of. It's not our job to do this, as they're doing a fine job of it on their own, and they will be able to amend this all once they have an actual election. Now, our third voting issue in today's debate is an our world versus their world scenario. In their world, the U.S. threatens to eliminate aid, preventing our government and the Egyptian government from actually helping the citizens, putting them in imminent danger of falling below the poverty line. Eventually, leaders will be appointed who are not appropriate for a position of power, creating a corrupt government. And now, in our world, in the nation's world, the status quo is what's going to happen. The status quo will continue to stay the status quo. The U.S. will provide aid to help the Egyptians, and the Egyptian government will as well. This means that the Egyptians will continue to have the money that they need to put food on their children's plates, and they will continue to have daycare for their people, these social services that are necessary and that are already being taken care of by their government. And now eventually elections will take place in November, putting a stable democracy in place, which will lead to the benefits that both teams have argued for. So what you really need to take into consideration in today's debate is, do you think that the government should have control of things until they actually have an election, which is coming which is coming up anyway, or do you think that this power should be taken away from them when there's no problem with the military actually having this power right now, when it's already going to happen inherently? Thank you.
I could use your timer.
Oh yeah.
Are you leaving?
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Are you
Is
staying?
that the last speech?
Is everybody ready? Okay, great. Okay, once again, on behalf of the proposition team, just a blanket of thanks to everybody in this room. With that, I'm going to jump in. And Judge, today I'm here to convince you in the last speech of this debate of why you should vote for the proposition team. I have two main voting issues for you. They're not really voting issues per se, but they're voting reasons, voting questions that I'm going to ask you. But before I do that, unfortunately, I need to address two misconceptions brought up by the negation. And unfortunately, they based their whole debate, and their whole case and their whole opposition to our plan based on these two misconceptions. The first misconception is elections matter. Judge, my partner and I are sitting here and we're like, what is going on? They've worked this debate into something that it's not. They've said that, the proposition team is arguing that we're stopping the elections plan in November and we're going to just immediately have an election right now, and who's running, we don't know, but that's what we're doing. That's not what we're saying, Judge. In my speech, I didn't mention anything about moving the elections. This is what we're arguing, Judge. Right now, we have the military in Egypt. They're controlling both the military and the interior departments. The problem is that the military also likes to keep some of its interior pet projects, like childcare, like auto repairs, whatever. We're saying is that during this transition, when the Democratic leaders coming in, that in the military area, those car services, those hotel services should be moved to the interior department. We're really not talking about this top hierarchy because, Judge, as we both agreed, elections will happen in November in this transfer of power. So clearly, this misconception really just is flushed right off to the proposition side. Now, their second misconception is that of harms. They say, you have no harm, no harm, no harm, no harm. We say, come on, yes, we do have harms. We've brought up how awful this would be. We've mentioned how the military has its own priorities and that when it doesn't, we see some things that happen in Nigeria, where their democracy was ruined. Clearly, the military is not beneficial, and I really want to address this more in my voting issues, or in my voting questions. But before I do that, unlike how she refused to take a POI, I will take a POI from the
Sorry,
opposition.
so I know you're addressing this concept about how we're scared of military involvement, we're scared of military controlling, but can you tell me what is currently going on in Egypt that allows us this logical reasoning that the military being in control of these programs is harming Egyptians? Can you give me that evidence?
Well, I think there's a lot of potential harm. Right now, you're right. There's not a direct harm saying that the military shouldn't be running the child care. But this is the problem, and this is what you really haven't addressed. And I'd like to now transition to the voting questions. Judge, I'm going to ask you two questions based on the judging criteria. What would you want as an Egyptian, and what would you want as an American? Let's start with the first question. Judge, what would you want as an Egyptian? Would you want the military controlling your life? Now it might seem okay, you've just been through this revolution, like, hey, yeah, military, that's great. But that's not what you ultimately want. You want organizations that are separate. Let's look to the United States where, for example, we have separate entities. Like I was saying, we have the Department of Health and Human Services, we have the Department of Defense. Both are very different and both are clearly separated. That's what it should be in Egypt. And if the United States values it that much, the United States doesn't need to give its aid, Judge. But if it does, it's going to want to give it to a democracy that it supports. We see that the United States government and the people of the United States don't support this mixed government. So why would we want to give money to a government that's all mixed like this? We should be giving money only if it's separated. And again, I ask, how would you want it as an Egyptian? How would it be in the world of the Egyptians? You wouldn't want the military in there because because military powers are prone to abuse. We pointed to Nigeria, perhaps the only example outside this realm of debate, and we showed how this is huge. How this would not be a benefit and in turn would be a detriment to the Egyptian people. We pointed out how the military has its own job and you wouldn't want it involved. And we furthermore pointed out that it says the Egyptian people have a choice. We're not saying that they have to make this choice. We're saying they have the option. Yes, they may not get the aid, but they still have the choice. We believe that the Egyptian people don't value this military authority, and we believe that they would choose this option. And now let's look at the second option. What would you want as an American judge? You would want soft power. You would get this. My partner turned this. You would get money that's better spent with your values, and you would get your foreign policy better achieved. That's why it's so imperative to enact this plan. That's why you should vote in favor of House and Jeffrey. Thank you.